Hello, my name is Paul Reed, and I am a postdoc at the University of Oregon. For today's conservation conversation, I am joined by Dr. Sarah Hamman, who is the Director of Science at Ecostudies Institute in Olympia. For today's conversation, I will be talking about prairies in the western Pacific Northwest and how they are being affected by climate change. In particular, I will discuss an experiment that colleagues and I conducted at Capital Land Trust's Tilley West Preserve. And then Sarah will take over and discuss prairie restoration efforts in the South Sound region and how plant responses to climate change may affect local prairie management in the future. Pacific Northwest prairies are truly stunning ecosystems, as evident in this photo here, taken of a native prairie at the Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington. Prior to European settlement, prairies were widespread and abundant throughout the Klamath Mountains, Willamette Valley, and Puget Lowland ecoregions of Western Oregon and Washington. Historically, these ecosystems were dominated by a diversity of native bunch grasses and forbs, and they were maintained for thousands of years through frequent burning by indigenous people as they provided food, hunting grounds, and other important resources. This map shows the habitat distribution of the Willamette Valley in the mid-1800s, which you can see was largely composed of prairie habitat in yellow. Unfortunately today, it's estimated that as little as 1% to 2% of original prairie habitat remains across this region. This habitat has been primarily lost by the disruption of the historical fire regimes, land use change, such as converting of land for agriculture and urbanization, and the spread of invasive species, most notably pasture grasses from Europe. This is habitat that is critical for threatened and endangered species such as the golden paintbrush, Taylor's checker spot butterfly, the streaked horned lark, and the Mazama pocket gopher, among many others. This is also habitat that provides incredibly important cultural resources and traditional foods, such as camas bulbs, for Native American communities. Because these prairies are so highly endangered, there are a lot of conservation and restoration efforts in native prairies across the region. Unfortunately, however, these efforts are being challenged today because climate change threatens to further degrade these ecosystems. This figure here shows the observed and projected temperature increase in the state of Oregon. We can see in recent years how we've been consistently above the baseline normal temperatures in the state. Looking at projections for the remainder of the 21st century, we can see anywhere from a 2.5 to a 5 degrees Celsius increase in mean annual temperature, depending on different emissions scenarios. That equates to about 4 to 9 degrees in Fahrenheit. As conditions become hotter and drier, this is putting native plant species at risk of decline, as it likely becomes increasingly difficult for them to survive our long summer drought periods and to compete with invasive species. From a management perspective, there are some important questions to ask relating to how climate change will affect the plant ecology of Pacific Northwest prairies. First, will climate change affect where native plant species can persist across this region? And then how will this affect the structure and diversity of prairie plant communities? To answer these questions, colleagues and I conducted the Heating of Prairie Systems, or HOPS experiment. HOPS was a large climate manipulation experiment which took place between 2015 to 2019 at 3 sites across Western Oregon and Washington. Our southern site was located in Selma, Oregon, while our central site was located just west of Eugene at the southern end of the Willamette Valley. Our northern site was at Capital Land Trust's Tilley West Preserve, just south of Olympia. These 3 sites span a 520-kilometer latitudinal climate gradient in which conditions become progressively hotter and drier toward the south. At each site, we established 20 experimental plots, which you can see in this fantastic drone photo taken by Capital Land Trust. These 20 plots per site were evenly divided into 4 different climate treatments. The first treatment was simply a control, with these plots experiencing ambient temperatures and precipitation. Next was a drought treatment where we used a fixed rainout shelter design to intercept 40% of precipitation above these plots, to mimic an extreme drought event for the region. We also had a warming treatment where we used infrared heaters attached to data logging equipment to heat these plots by 2.5 degrees Celsius above the ambient temperatures recorded in the control plots. And lastly, we had a warming plus irrigation treatment in which these plots were also heated by 2.5 degrees Celsius, but were irrigated with additional rainfall, which was done to counteract the soil drying side effect of the warming treatment in order to deconfound warming from drying. Within each plot, we created restored prairie communities by seeding in several native species. We seeded in about 30 native species in total, but focused in on these 14 focal species to study how their populations were responding to climate change and whether those responses to climate change differed across the experimental sites. Among these focal species, we had 6 native perennials and 8 native annuals. These species can also be grouped into different geographic range classes. Most of these species occur southward into California. But these first 4 species down here are considered range limited within the context of our experiment because they only occur as far south as the Klamath Mountain ecoregion, making them within range at our southern experimental site, but planted beyond range at both the central and northern sites. This next group of 3 species occurs up into the Willamette Valley and essentially to the Columbia River, but not any further north. So they were planted beyond range at our northern experimental site. And then this last group of 7 species occur along the entire west coast into British Columbia, making them within range at all 3 experimental sites. By choosing sets of species with differing geographic ranges and differing life histories, this allowed us to ask whether certain species may be more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than others. One of the first major findings of our study was that regardless of the experimental site, our native annual species tended to decline with warming. This figure is showing population growth rates across all sites for the 8 native annual species we studied. The x-axis represents climate, where conditions are cooler toward the left and warmer toward the right. The y-axis represents the population growth rate, where a value in the middle at this dashed line represents a stable population. Anything above this line is growing, and anything below this line is a declining population. The space here between these 2 black vertical lines represents the climate conditions that occurred in the control plots. So this is the ambient climate area. Anything to the right of this black vertical line represents the climate conditions experienced in the warmed plots, thus representing future climate conditions. As we look at each species' population growth rate line, we can see that most species had generally stable or growing populations under ambient conditions. Once we reach this tipping point into a warmer future, however, we can see that most species populations crash and begin to decline very quickly. There was only a single species, Aristida, in brown, that benefited from warming, and it's interesting to note that this is a C4 grass species, which are typically more common in warmer environments. In opposition to the native annuals, we found that invasive annuals become increasingly dominant with climate change, especially toward the southern end of our experiment. This first figure here shows that as temperatures increase, invasive annual cover increases, meaning that invasive annual species represent a greater proportion of the entire community. And then as invasive annual cover increases, the diversity of the community decreases as a result. The invasive annuals in our experiment tended to be these early season winter annual grasses shown in the photo here. By and large, these grasses tended to be problematic species that made it extremely difficult to reestablish native species in their presence. These annual grass species benefit from warmer temperatures by getting a head start on growth during the winter months when temperature is most limiting. These species take off super early with warming, and then they create dense, smothering canopies like you can see in this photo. Once established, they use up a lot of the soil moisture and soil nutrients early in the season, making it difficult for later growing native species to compete. As a result, we ended up with communities that were essentially dominated by this one functional group. This phenomenon occurred to the strongest degree in the South, where conditions were already the hottest and driest. It also occurred to a pretty strong extent at the central site, and it didn't occur much in the northern site, which tended to have more non-native perennial grasses than annual grasses. As a result, we ended up with this gradient across the experimental sites, where we still maintained a diversity of native forbs and grasses in the north. We had kind of a mix of invasive annual grasses and a few native forbs at the central site, and then mostly just invasive annual grasses in the south. It's worth noting that these invasive annual grasses are already the dominant species found in California grasslands. These are species which grow during the winter months and senesce early in the season, creating those rolling hills of gold that you find in California by late April. Essentially, climate change is causing Pacific Northwest prairies to become more similar to the grasslands in California. Finally, with our perennial species, we found evidence that species ranges may need to shift with climate change. You may recall that Festuca, Microceros, and Danthonia are species that are found along the entire West Coast, from California up through the Puget lowlands of Western Washington and British Columbia. So those species were within range at all three of our experimental sites. What we found with these species was that their populations all declined with warming and drought, regardless of the experimental site. Sedelcia and Ranunculus were our two range-limited perennial species, as they're only found in these limited ranges in Western Oregon. Like these other three species, Sedelcia and Ranunculus also declined with warming and drought when they were planted at those sites within their ranges. Interestingly, however, populations of these species actually improved with warming and drought when they were planted beyond their northern range limits at the northern experimental site. These results showed us evidence then that species are likely going to struggle where they are currently found as conditions become hotter and drier. But if they can reach new habitats that are further north or perhaps higher in elevation where conditions are cooler and moister, they may stand a chance at persisting into the future. These results then highlight the urgency of establishing prairie conservation corridors to facilitate the movement of native prairie species to track favorable climatic conditions. This map here is a modified version of a conservation concept map put together by the Willamette Valley Oak Prairie Cooperative. All the spots in red are existing conserved prairie anchor sites, meaning they are some of the best remaining examples of prairie habitat in the Willamette Valley. The gold region represents core conservation areas, where regional organizations are targeting to protect, conserve, and restore native prairies, creating connected habitat across the region to facilitate species movements. As more conservation occurs into the future, there could be the potential to establish conservation corridors that allow species to migrate higher in elevation, such as into the Coast Range or into the Klamath Mountains, or allow Cascade Mountains, or allow species from the Klamath Mountains further south to migrate into the Willamette Valley, or perhaps allow species in the Willamette Valley to migrate further north into Western Washington. But with the landscape being so highly fragmented, with lots of agricultural land and large urban areas in between, it may be difficult or nearly impossible to expect species, especially plants, to be able to migrate effectively on their own. And if that is the case, then some of these native prairie species may require increasing intervention and possibly assisted translocation to facilitate their persistence into the future. To summarize the major findings of our hops experiment, we found that native prairie species tend to be in disequilibrium with future climates. Many of them appear as if they are going to decline where they are currently found as conditions become hotter and drier. On top of that, Pacific Northwest prairies are becoming more like grasslands in California, and we may begin to see an increasing dominance by invasive annual grasses, especially toward the southern end of our region at first. As a result, it will become more critical to facilitate the movement of native prairie species toward more favorable locations and to protect what little limited prairie habitat remains. With that, I need to acknowledge all the important collaborators and contributors to the Hops Project, and would like to thank Capital Land Trust once again for allowing us to conduct our experiment at Tilley West Preserve. And now I will hand it over to Sarah, who will discuss some of the implications of these findings for prairie restoration in the South Sound region.
All right, thank you, Paul. All right, can you see the full screen?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk today about some of the work that we're doing up here in Washington to restore diversity and resilience to the prairies of the Pacific Northwest, incorporating some of the knowledge and information that Paul has just shared, and also including some of the new partnerships and collaborations that have been developing in this region to, hopefully enhance the connectivity and opportunities for species movement in the face of climate change. So I first want to just really quickly introduce the restoration process here. So for the last several decades, partners working in prairie conservation and restoration have really worked through this process that involves generally removing invasive species, preparing a site for native plant enhancement, and then ultimately establishing native plants and animals onto a site to reach this Shangri-La of a restored prairie. Obviously, as everyone here probably knows, this is not necessarily a linear process, despite how I have it arranged here. There's lots of opportunities and needs to kind of loop back to earlier stages to address new invasive species challenges or to conduct additional site preparation. And it's really a complex combination of strategies that are needed to restore the trophic structure and the functioning of these prairies. But ultimately, our goal is to increase the habitat quality and the ecosystem resiliency of these communities. So the first step in this restoration process really focuses on invasive species removal. And for many years, the primary target there has been Scotch broom on the top left, with Cytisus scoparius. And we've learned as a community pretty well how to remove Scotch broom from the prairies. It's a long-term process, but there are several strategies that are effective. Over the last few decades, some additional non-native species have popped up that have been more challenging to eradicate, including some of the pasture grasses like tall oat grass, the oxeye daisy, Leucanthemum vulgare, reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinaceae in our wetland prairies, and Hypochorus radicata as another example of a non-native forb that is quite persistent on the prairies. And related to what Paul was just talking about, we have a new arrival within the last 3 or 4 years, rat-tailed fescue, which is Vulpia maiuros. This picture kind of does represent those golden waves of grain that Paul mentioned that are so common to the grasslands of California. This was taken from a prairie preserve here in Southwest Washington, where you can see just mats of the rat-tailed fescue established across the site. We have several trials ongoing to try to figure out how to remove this species, but it is a stubborn one and something that we're recognizing as an increasing challenge for prairie management. So in addition to kind of our targeted invasive removal methods, we also often use fire as a prairie restoration tool. And the fire program here in the South Puget Sound has really expanded over the last 15 years. And this has been both for restoration purposes and for wildfire risk reduction. So you can see here in this figure that from 2005 up to just last year, 2021, the number of burns has increased from about 2 per year up to around 100 per year over the last 15 years. And the total area burn has increased from less than 100 acres per year to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 over the last few years. Certainly with the last 2 years of COVID, we've seen a drop just in terms of access and permitting, et cetera. But we expect to be back up to that 3,000 plus acres per year across, this is actually much of Western Washington. And so, yeah, the fire collaborations and the acres that we've treated and the habitat types has really expanded. You can see here on Jones Island State Park, this is up in the San Juans. This is the entire island is a state park, and we burned some of the prairie balds to enhance habitat there, and then seeded in native species. Also worked with partners down in the Willamette Valley. This is at the Finley Wildlife Area to burn to enhance habitat there. And we're working with a lot of partners down there to expand opportunities for prescribed fire programs. And then we do a lot of work on Joint Base Lewis McChord. Here you can see we're burning Scotch broom, but here in the South Sound, we have several sites off base as well, where burning is a primary restoration tool. So after we put fire on the landscape and are able to at least initiate the removal of invasive species, we are at the stage where we're ready to reintroduce native plants. And this is a challenging process. There's been a lot of research over the years to identify how and when and what to seed to get the best results. Working with the Center for Natural Lands Management, we as a collective, but largely CNLM, has been able to increase the number of pounds of native seed produced, which is shown here in red, up to, this is a little outdated, but the numbers are close here. In 2017, there was over 3,000 pounds of seed produced, and we're hovering around 100 different native prairie species. So this covers species for most of Western Washington and some Oregon sites as well. You can see I've listed a couple native annuals here. There actually has been a push over the last 5 years or so to really increase the production of native annuals, with the expectation that we need to fill those niches, those really early season and winter, late winter, early spring germination and establishment times with these native annuals, because otherwise they are quickly getting filled with non-native annuals, especially as the climate warms. And so for these northern sites, having these native annuals in place is going to be very helpful. But there's a lot of discussion and interest in understanding how and how we should incorporate species from farther south, incorporate sourcing of our native species from not just different species, but also the genetic material from farther south, to be able to provide the greatest level of success for our native seeding efforts here up in Washington. So that's an ongoing discussion, and one that I think it's going to take a few years to figure out the protocols for that, but there's a lot of interest, and the work that Paul just presented is really helpful in providing some guidance on how to do that. So the work that's been done so far has really led to, has put us on a road to success for several rare species, primarily on protected lands. So golden paintbrush, Taylor's checker spot butterfly, streaked horn lark have all seen a lot of progress in terms of their populations and kind of stability of those populations. However, you know, when we think about the regions that those species have really expanded, it's mostly been in kind of central and northwestern Washington in the blue area, and down in the Willamette Valley. There's this section here that I've outlined in red, that on this map that Paul had provided, that represents an area that has not received a lot of attention in terms of conservation and restoration actions. There's very little prairie conservation work occurring in this portion of Southwest Washington, largely because the prairie land here is nearly all privately owned. It's an incredibly important region for conservation going forward, as it can provide a corridor for those species from the Willamette Valley that are migrating north. And so we've been working with private landowners here to try to understand how we can enhance habitat and provide opportunities for conservation. I'm just going to highlight a couple of projects. The first here, we're actually wrapping up a study where we evaluated the ecological and economic benefit cost comparison of grazed and ungrazed prairie land for critical species. And this was a project where we worked with private landowners to test different grazing regimes, primarily what we've called conservation grazing, where you have high intensity rotational grazing and seed in native species in the fall, and then have a spring rest period to allow native species to get established. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we found that this has worked quite well to enhance the native plant establishment and support butterfly habitat and support Mazama pocket gopher populations. So this is something that we, in partnership with the ranchers and several different agencies, we've been trying to communicate, and with several outreach events. And we're kind of taking the show on the road with this work to expand it to that area that I mentioned before that has received very little attention over the last few years. And so a recently funded project here shows that we are aiming to enhance the biodiversity of the prairie habitat while also maintaining the economic, or even benefiting the economic resilience of the rural communities in Southwest Washington. And we're hoping to do that through conservation grazing. So partnering with local landowners, with private landowners who are interested in enhancing the habitat on their properties, matching them up to small ranching businesses who are interested in leasing land for grazing their animals, providing training for both the landowners and the ranchers. And the training will include things like sustainable farming and grazing practices, prairie ecology, climate change mitigation, small business management. All of those things can help to provide sustainable operations and enhance the habitat on these prairie working lands. In addition to this, we are prioritizing veteran landowners and veteran ranchers to consider the benefiting their economic conditions and connecting them to resources for veterans throughout the state. The goal here is really to build connectivity across this landscape, enhancing the conservation value of working lands while supporting these small farming businesses. And then the last thing I want to highlight here, because this is a cultural ecosystem that we're working in, we are recognizing and partnering with several regional tribes, also with state and federal agencies, nonprofits, and universities, to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, priorities, and practices into collaborative prairie management going forward. There are lots of lessons that have been gained over millennia of working and tending to these ecosystems that we think will be very helpful and provide reciprocal benefits for all of those involved going into the future. So to wrap up, restoring diversity and resilience to Pacific Northwest prairies really needs to incorporate species that can thrive in warmer, drier conditions, as we've seen evidenced by some of Paul's work. And we need to start thinking about sourcing seed for our restoration from areas farther south from where we're conducting our work. Thinking beyond the conservation preserve model provides opportunities for creating habitat corridors, working with private landowners, and then ultimately creating opportunities for collaborative transdisciplinary partnerships that provide reciprocal benefits for all of those involved, can help to really connect landscapes across the ecoregion. And with that, I will wrap it up, and I think we can take some questions.